We left off with hunger and eating last time, so we are starting with sexual behavior, finishing chapter 10, and then getting into the beginning of chapter 11. Right. The physiological mechanisms behind sex. The hypothalamus plays an important role in motivated behavior, including sex. So, some research that made lesions to the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus were shown to completely disrupt a male rat's ability to engage in sexual behavior, but it did not affect the sexual motivation. They found that he will still seek to gain access to sexually receptive females. So this suggests that the ability to engage in sexual behavior in terms of the actual physical mechanisms to do so and the motivation to do so are mediated by different systems in the brain. In humans, the disorders that involve abnormal hypothalamic function are often associated with hypogonadism, so reduced function of the gonads, and reduced sexual function, whereas hormones secreted by the endocrine glands, like testosterone, influence sexual motivation and behavior. The amygdala and nucleus accumbens are involved in motivation for sexual behavior, but they do not affect the ability to engage in it. So damage in rats that results in a decreased motivation to engage in sexual behavior, while the ability to do so is still intact. Right, Dr. Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s noticed that there was a severe lack of empirically based information on sex during that 1940s period, and so he initiated a large-scale survey. During this time, sex was very much a taboo subject, and many people had a hard time even talking to their doctors about it, let alone their spouses, their sexual partners, their friends. And so this led to a lot of uninformed people, misinformed people, and just a lack of understanding about sex as a topic at large. And so after he was able to compile his research, he found that behaviors that were really thought to be rare at that time ended up being revealed to be much more common than previously thought. And he was really influential in shaping future research on human sexual behavior and motivation, and it really was the catalyst for a lot more research to be done. So through his survey research, Kinsey produced 2 best-selling books containing statistics and plenty of taboo vocabulary. The first one was Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, published in 1948, followed by Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. They initially sold incredibly well, invoking conversations surrounding the previously unspoken topic of sex. Kinsey's research was not without its problems. However, psychologists cannot deny that he had a powerful impact on the study of sexual behavior, and he opened the door to not only experts continuing the work, but everyday conversations that were not taking place prior. Due to improvements in the processes of scientific research to ensure accuracy, much of Kinsey's data may be rejected as inaccurate in today's age. His refusal to use randomized samples was criticized at the time of his research. And more recently has published comments regarding his opinion that victims of pedophilia were not harmed by the abuse they experienced have been brought to light and obviously aggressively challenged as damaging. That's clearly an inaccurate assumption and not true in the slightest. He did have a lot of innovative findings for the times. We have to remember that this was in the 1940s, and again, just the fact that people were not really talking about sex led to a lot of beliefs that were incorrect. And one of those beliefs from the 1940s was that women were asexual. A lot of people believed that women did not desire sex, that women were not interested in sex, and that sex was kind of engaged in by women as a duty for their male partners, but not as something that they actually enjoyed. And what he found through his research is that women were as interested and experienced in sex as men. 25% of the women sampled had experienced an orgasm before the age of 15, and 64% had experienced orgasm before marriage. Another common belief for the time was that women did not masturbate and that both sexes could experience health complications from masturbation. It was kind of a common belief to have been told that if you masturbated excessively, that you could go blind. And so a lot of people did believe that, and they thought that masturbation could lead to certain health issues like that. And what they found was that, in fact, both males and females did masturbate, and that there were not adverse health consequences that would come because of it, especially not going blind. Another common belief for the time of the 1940s was that homosexual behavior was an abnormal, deviant act and that it was inherently wrong. They thought that it was not occurring very often at all, and that it was only for the rare instance where someone was some sort of immoral, person who had something wrong with them. And what they found was that relationships and sexual acts between people of the same sex and or the same gender were fairly common, even in the 1940s. And while people were not able to maybe safely reveal this publicly, it was still happening, and there was nothing abnormal, deviant, or wrong about it. Kinsey also developed what was called the Kinsey scale, and that's basically this way to describe sexuality in a way that is not necessarily black and white, if you will, and a way for people to be able to express that their attractions sexually are not explicitly heterosexual or homosexual. One would be that they may be asexual, and that would be the farthest on the end, that they don't have any sexual contacts or reactions to others. And then the other would be that people may not fall on one end or the other, where they are exclusively heterosexual or homosexual, and that they never have attractions or sexual thoughts about people on the other end of the spectrum. And that he found that many people do at times experience attraction and sexual desires for either same-sex people or opposite-sex people, and they fall kind of somewhere along this scale, and that oftentimes sexuality tends to be a little more fluid than what we might have typically believed in the past. It is no secret that for most of American history, the majority of Americans were not as comfortable with homosexual behavior as Dr. Alfred Kinsey was. And even after his landmark study, there was still a lot of discrimination and negative ideas when it came to the LGBTQ plus community. So remember, the study occurred in the 40s, and his first book was published, in 1948, and the APA still listed homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance in the DSM until 1973. So that was a long time after the study was done. Homosexuals were banned from working for the federal government. Sodomy laws were used to criminalize homosexuality. So you even had the chance of having to go to jail or prison for it. Same-sex marriage was banned. When did it become legal and recognized for the entire country? Was it not until 2015, 2016? I mean, I want to say 2015. Homosexuals were denied housing, jobs, social relationships due to sexual orientation. Slurs and discriminatory language were widely accepted. I mean, sometimes they still are today, depending on where you are and who you're with. Openly gay men and women were not allowed to serve in the military, but in the 90s, President Bill Clinton did pass a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which, was under the guise of trying to protect gay servicemen and women, basically saying like, oh, well, they can serve as long as no one asks if you're gay and then no one tells if you're gay, right? But it still did not protect everyone from homophobic violence. So Kinsey's publications controversially presented homosexual behavior as being a healthy sexual expression during a time when that opinion was literally unheard of in the U.S. But it did prompt decades of research by psychologists trying to figure out what determines a person's sexual orientation and if anything dangerous or abnormal was occurring, because that was the belief at the time when he did his research. And it has since been determined that family backgrounds and experiences are relatively similar among hetero and homosexuals. Research suggests that there is a genetic component in the determination of sexual orientation. There's no evidence that sexual orientation can be changed. Homosexuality is not a mental illness, dangerous, or unhealthy, and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is now illegal. So why does it matter that we consider these things, that we talk about these things? And that is so that we can make sure that the LGBTQ plus community feels safe, that they feel accepted, and that they feel loved for who they are. Because when that doesn't happen, then some serious mental health situations can occur. This just shows some 2022 stats on the rates of considered and attempted suicide by LGBTQ youth. And you can see how high some of those rates are. And then on youth who wanted to get mental health care but were unable to for a variety of reasons. So it is really important that they feel supported and loved, and that they have the resources that they need when they are not feeling those ways. When we define sexual orientation, it is defined as emotional and erotic attraction toward another individual. It is a relatively stable characteristic of a person. It is not a choice. Between 3% and 10% of the adult population identifies as homosexual. It was previously thought to be caused by different socialization and familial experiences, but research shows that those experiences can be very similar in homosexuals and heterosexuals. There is genetic and biological mechanisms. Research has found differences in brain structure and function between heterosexuals and homosexuals. So after Dr. Kinsey did his initial research, then more research started to be conducted. He really opened that door. So Masters and Johnson conducted a study of physiological responses during sexual behavior, where they actually observed people engaging in sexual behaviors. I'm not entirely sure what types of people decided to sign up as participants in this, but I'm sure they were very interesting. And so Masters and Johnson measured the physiological variables like blood pressure and respiration rate, as well as the sexual arousal variables like vaginal lubrication and penile tumescence. So the sexual response cycle was labeled as 4 different stages. First was excitement with the arousal phase, including erection and lubrication, then plateau with increased swelling and blood flow to the labia minora and pre-ejaculatory fluid, then culminating in orgasm with rhythmic contractions and ejaculation, and then ending with resolution with the return to the unaroused state. Okay, gender identity is one sense of being male or female. Our gender identities do not always correspond to our biological sex. Gender dysphoria is a diagnosis describing individuals who do not identify as the gender that most people would assume they are. You need to experience this for at least 6 months, and it must result in significant distress or dysfunction to meet the diagnosis criteria. It is important to note the term significant distress or dysfunction. So just because someone's gender identity does not correspond with their biological sex does not mean that they have gender dysphoria. So if they identify as trans and they feel loved and supported by friends and family, and they are maybe on this journey of transitioning, and they are kind of meeting with a therapist, and everything is kind of going as smoothly as possible, and they are not having these feelings of significant distress or dysfunction, then they would not qualify in the criteria of having a gender dysphoria diagnosis. So it needs to meet that threshold of having significant distress or dysfunction in order to have that. That is an important piece. And if someone so chooses, then they can opt into transgender hormone therapy, which is the use of hormones to make one's body look more like the opposite sex, the one in which they identify. That is not always the choice that someone makes, but that is an option for someone who identifies as a different gender than their biological sex. This is Chaz Bono, a transgender male who is a well-known person that transitioned from female to male. In the 1970s, the world knew Chaz as Chastity Bono, the daughter of Sonny and Cher. you can see in the picture, but later in life, Chaz transitioned to align his physical body with his gender identity. And this is Laverne Cox, who you may recognize is openly transgender and is the first transgender actress to portray a transgender character on a regular television series. You might recognize her from Orange is the New Black on Netflix. So, unfortunately, a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community are no stranger to violent behaviors. And sometimes when it gets to the point of going to court, they can even be blamed for their own violent attack. And this can be referred to as the gay or trans panic legal defense. So, oftentimes when a gay or trans person is the victim of a violent attack or even sometimes a murder, then if the situation is such where it was some sort of a social situation and people were hanging out and talking, or even if the victim was friends with the perpetrator, and there became some point where the perpetrator felt like the victim was hitting on them or acting in a manner that made them feel like the victim was attracted to them of sorts, made some sort of an unwanted pass at them, then the perpetrator is straight, or at least wants to be known as straight, then the perpetrator lashes out violently. And their defense is that they were so surprised, or they were so shocked, or they were so scared, they were terrified, or they were traumatized that they then reacted in a violent manner because of this unwanted attention. And that is how the assault or murder occurred. And this strategy has been used in courtrooms across the country for, decades. And it's been effectively used. Some people have been found not guilty. And some people have gotten off on much lesser charges using this defense. But it's basically a victim blaming tactic, saying that someone who was gay or trans deserved their violent assault or their murder just because they gave some sort of unwanted attention to their attacker. Now, it has received a lot of criticism in recent history, and therefore it has become outlawed in certain states. So California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, and DC. But it still is perfectly legal as a trial strategy in all 36 other states. So, like I said, it's important to recognize it and to realize that it's being used as a way to victimize people a second time in a way that says that they were not worth their life. This is one of the most famous cases that used gay panic as a defense. The victim was Scott Amador, and the murderer was Jonathan Schmitz. And basically, Scott went on the Jenny Jones talk show to secretly reveal to Jonathan that he had a crush on him. Jonathan knew he was going on the show to have someone reveal a secret crush, but he didn't know who. And the show kind of hem and hawed whenever Jonathan asked, like, oh, well, is it a girl? Is it a guy? And they're like, oh, it could be either one. And he basically said he didn't want it to be a guy. And they're like, oh, don't worry, it's a girl. But then he went on the show, and there was a guy friend of his, Scott, and there was a girlfriend of his. And he knew Scott was gay, and he didn't have a problem with Scott being his friend. But then when Scott revealed that he was the one who had the secret crush, you could tell he was embarrassed, and he did not love that being revealed to him on TV. But then the three friends kind of ended up hanging out later and going back home. But 3 days later, it seems like maybe Jonathan had time to contemplate what it really was going to mean for that episode to air. And he bought a gun and went to Scott's house and murdered him. And in his trial, he tried to blame the fact that he couldn't think straight because he was so taken aback by being told about this secret crush and being worried what people would think about him when they saw it, and blaming his upbringing and the fact that his grandparents were homophobic and his parents were homophobic, and that he had been told all his life that if a gay man has an interest in you, then that must mean that you're gay. And so he used all of that as his legal strategy to say that, you know, he felt like he had to murder Scott because otherwise people were going to assume that he was gay too. He ended up getting only second-degree murder instead of first. And he got 25 to 50 years, but this was in 1995, I think. And he was already out of prison in 2017. So, seems like it worked because he was out pretty early. Another example is of Islan Nettles here. She was walking home with a friend and ran into James Dixon and his friends, and they just started talking. Dixon was pretty drunk and was flirting with Nettles, whom he quote-unquote thought was a female. And then one of his buddies shouted, "That's a guy." So Dixon pushed Nettles away. She pushed back. And then Dixon said that he tripped and got enraged, so he punched her in the face. Nettles fell down and hit her head on the curb, causing a serious brain injury. Then Dixon swung a second punch as she lay on the ground while driving the side of her head into the pavement. She was in a coma for 3 days before taken off life support. When he was being interviewed, he said that he felt duped and humiliated by the revelation of the victim's gender identity. So it just shows that these kinds of attacks are still happening, and they are going to continue to use this type of defense. He only got 12 years in prison. So we still have a lot of work to do in protecting the LGBTQ plus community, one, from assaults, and then two, from being blamed for their own assaults and murders in court. All right, that is all of chapter 10. We're going to move on to chapter 11 now, on personality. Personality is the long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. It comes from the Latin word persona, a mask worn by an actor. In ancient times, theatrical masks were used to represent or project a specific personality trait. Hippocrates in 370 BC theorized that personality traits and human behaviors were based on 4 separate temperaments associated with 4 fluids or humors of the body. So there was choleric, which is yellow bile from the liver, which is basically your pee. Melancholic, which is black bile from the kidneys, which I've researched this a few times and can't find any actual bodily fluid that would be black bile from the kidneys. Sanguine, which is red blood from the heart, and then phlegmatic, which is white phlegm from the lungs. Galen then took that perspective and expanded it because he believed that both physical and medical diseases and personality differences could be explained by imbalances in the humors, and that each person exhibited one of the 4 temperaments. This was really the prevalent view for over 1,000 years and through the Middle Ages. So if you had too much or too little of one of the humors, then that could tell you why you were maybe suffering from some sort of medical issue, and it would also explain your personality. So choleric was described as passionate, ambitious, and bold. Melancholic, reserved, anxious, and unhappy. Sanguine, joyful, eager, and optimistic. And phlegmatic was calm, reliable, and thoughtful. Phrenology was developed by Franz Gall in 1780. He proposed that the distance between bumps on the skull reveal a person's personality traits, character, and mental abilities. It was discredited for a lack of empirical support. He developed a chart that depicted which areas of the skull corresponded to particular personality traits or characteristics, and said that measuring the distances revealed the size of the brain underneath, and it could tell you which traits could correspond with which size. Immanuel Kant in the 18th century agreed with Galen that individuals could be categorized into one of the 4 temperaments, and he developed a list of traits to describe the personality of each of the 4 temperaments, as you can see here. And then William Wundt in the 19th century suggested that personality could also be described using 2 major axes, so emotional and non-emotional, and then changeable and unchangeable. Right, so we are now getting into the psychodynamic perspectives of the 20th century with Sigmund Freud and the Neo-Freudians. So Freud created the first comprehensive theory of personality that tried to explain both normal and abnormal behaviors. And he proposed that the unconscious drives are influenced by sex, aggression, and childhood sexuality that influences personality. And the Neo-Freudians were influenced by his work in that they agreed that our childhood experiences do matter, but they thought that there was less emphasis on sex, and they tried to focus on the social environment and effects of culture on personality instead. So the unconscious is mental activity that we are unaware of and are unable to access. According to Freud, he said that we are only aware of a small amount, about 1/10 of our mind's activities, and most of it remains hidden from us in our unconscious. So he said that we have unacceptable urges and desires that are kept in our unconscious through repression, and the information in our unconscious affects our behavior, although we are unaware of it. So basically, there's a whole lot going on in our mind that tells us what to do, and we don't really know why we're engaging in most of our behaviors because it is impacted by the unconscious, is what Freud would say. All right, so the id, the ego, and the superego. So Freud posited that our personality results from efforts to balance two competing forces. So one, you have the biological, aggressive, and pleasure-seeking drives. So basically you have like this animalistic side of you that is constantly trying to get these urges fulfilled, basically. And then you have this other internal, more socialized aspect of yourself that has control over these pleasure-seeking drives. And those are kind of constantly fighting back and forth with each other. So he described this process as an interaction between three different systems. First is your id, and that is the part of you that contains those primitive urges. This is almost like your caveman-esque side. And it is constantly trying to fulfill your desires for hunger, thirst, sex, anything that you desire in the moment. It's impulsive, it's instinctual, it operates on the pleasure principle, it seeks immediate gratification. So it's basically like saying, me want now, constantly. And so if you were in an in-person class and your id determined that you were hungry and you saw that you had a classmate that had a snack out, if you were purely operating on your id, then you would like jump out of your seat and grab their snack and just shove it in your mouth right then and there, okay? Because your id is only going to care about fulfilling that desire, okay? It's not going to care about anyone else. It's not going to care about being judged. It's not going to care about being clean. It's not going to care about the other person's germs. It's only caring about getting pleasure and gratification from the urge that you had from being hungry in that moment. Okay? Your superego, on the other hand, develops through interactions with others, where you learn the social rules for right and wrong, your moral compass that tells you how you should behave based on those rules. And it really is not even just like about, oh, well, at least I tried my best for those rules. It strives for perfection. It judges your behavior. And it's going to lead to your feelings of either pride or guilt. It wants you to be the best of the best that you can absolutely be in terms of moral righteousness. Okay, so you can think of the id and the superego as almost like the devil and the angel on the shoulder of a cartoon character, trying to convince it to do the either the thing that it wants to do right now, to gratify it, as the devil, that's the id, or the angel on the other side of the cartoon character that's like, no, you need to think about, all these other things, and you need to do what's righteous and good and blah blah blah, right? And then the ego or the self is the cartoon character, right? That's our true personality. And that attempts to balance the id with the superego. That's our rational self. It operates on the reality principle. So it tries to help the id satisfy desires in a realistic way. So back to our, eating our classmates' snack example, you might tell yourself like, hey, like maybe let's not go steal our classmates' snack. Maybe let's wait 10 minutes till there's a break and go get something from the vending machine. Okay, and this is the part of the personality that's actually seen by others. You probably wouldn't reveal your id to other people because then people might not like what they see because they might be kind of scared. According to Freud, the id can get pretty nasty. It can be violent and it can be overtly sexual, and it can be animalistic. So you probably would not share the innermost compulsivity of your id with other people if you knew what was going on in there, which, it's supposed to be your unconscious, so you don't. And then same with your superego. It can be really judgmental. It can be kind of holier than thou. And so, again, if you knew what was mostly going on in your superego, you probably wouldn't want to share that part of yourself with other people either. So the ego is like your actual true self. It operates within reason, and that is the way that you kind of keep your id and your superego at a reasonable range. So if you have a balanced id and superego, then Freud would say that you have a healthy personality. You've kind of figured it out. But if they are imbalanced, then that can lead to problems. If you let your id run rampant, then that's going to lead to extreme behaviors that could potentially lead to criminality, right? Aggression and all kinds of other issues, because if you are just seeking immediate gratification and nothing is stopping you, that's going to be dangerous. And your superego, if you allow that to run wild, then that could lead to neuroses. So anxiety disorders, just if you are being overly judgmental with yourself and seeking perfection that you can never actually attain, that is going to cause major problems as well. So that is Freud's theory of the id, ego, and superego. And you might have thought like, okay, well, that's not too unreasonable. Like, it kind of makes sense that we have these different parts of us that we have to kind of balance in order to be healthy. But you have to remember that there's really no empirical way to test this. So therefore, it's lacking fallibility, and we can't say like, yes, this is true, no, it's not true, and therefore it's the point is kind of moot there, right? So it's we can't really go from there and say that this is scientific. All right, the next concept is defense mechanisms. Freud said that this is the unconscious protective behaviors that work to reduce anxiety. They're used by the ego to restore balance between the id and the superego. Freud believed them to be used by everyone, but that overuse could be problematic. So the first one is denial. That's when we refuse to accept real events because they're unpleasant. The example is Kayla refuses to admit she has an alcohol problem, although she's unable to go a single day without drinking excessively. The next one is displacement, transferring inappropriate urges or behaviors onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. The example is during lunch at a restaurant, Mark is angry at his older brother, but does not express it, and instead is verbally abusive to the server. So just taking it out on people who are unable to maybe defend themselves, rather than taking it out on the people who deserve it, maybe. Projection, attributing unacceptable desires to others. Chris often cheats on her boyfriend because she suspects he's already cheating on her. So taking those behaviors that maybe you need to address and putting them on other people. Rationalization, justifying behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable reasons. We've talked about this before. Kim failed his history course because he did not study or attend class, but he told his roommates that he failed because the professor didn't like him. Reaction formation, reducing anxiety by adopting beliefs contrary to your own beliefs. Nadia is angry with her coworker Beth for always arriving late to work after a night of partying, but she's nice and agreeable to Beth and affirms that partying is cool. Regression, returning to coping strategies for less mature stages of development. After failing to pass his doctoral examinations, Giorgio spends days in bed, cuddling his favorite childhood toy. Repression, we've talked about, suppressing painful memories and thoughts. Lachey cannot remember her grandfather's fatal heart attack, although she was present. And then sublimation, redirecting unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. Jerome's desire for revenge on the drunk driver who killed his son is channeled into a community support group for people who've lost loved ones to drunk driving, which you might think, hey, that's a really positive thing to do and a great way to redirect that thought and those desires, which for the most part that is. The only issue can come if that person is not actually dealing with those feelings and dealing with that grief, and solely jumping into that support group as a way to kind of shy away from actually feeling their feelings of trauma, and then it can still bubble up in other ways. So, right, this is a video on defense mechanisms that I would encourage you to take a look at when you have a chance. It is important to discuss Anna Freud whenever talking about defense mechanisms as well. Her father tended to kind of focus on using defense mechanisms to kind of protect ourselves against our own minds, whereas she dove in a little deeper and looked at how we use them to protect maybe against like societal issues or against conflicts we were having with other people. And she also added a few new ones of her own. So it is important to consider her contribution to the idea of defense mechanisms as well. She added, let's see, I think she added intellectualization, focusing on the logical aspects of a situation to avoid emotions, identification, unconsciously adopting characteristics of another person, undoing, attempting to cancel out a previous thought or action, suppression, consciously choosing to ignore or push away thoughts or feelings, introjection, incorporating the values or beliefs of another person into one's own psyche, and turning against the self, a form of displacement where aggression is directed inward toward oneself. Right, getting into Freud's stages of psychosexual development, Freud theorized that children pass through 5 psychosexual stages. In each stage, the pleasure-seeking urges from the id are focused on a different erogenous zone or part of the body. And he said that if a child experiences a lack of proper nurturing and parenting during one of the conflicts, then that could result in the person becoming stuck or fixated in that stage, which then will culminate in some sort of personality issue or addiction or some sort of problem in adulthood. So the first stage is the oral stage, that is from birth to 1 year. The erogenous zone is the mouth, and the child derives their pleasure from eating and sucking. So the major conflict arises during weaning from being bottle or breastfed. And so if there is an issue during the weaning process, maybe it's too early, maybe it's too harsh, something occurs during this time, then as an adult, they could develop a smoking addiction, overeating issues, or nail biting problems. The next stage is the anal stage from 1 to 3 years old, where the erogenous zone is the anus. The child develops pleasure from bowel and bladder movements when they are going to the restroom. A conflict can arise during toilet training. So if the parent is too harsh during toilet training, like maybe they yell at the child or they spank the child or something like that, then as an adult, the child will become what's called having an anal retentive personality, where they will be stingy, stubborn, have a need for order and neatness. You might have heard the term being anal before, and that's where someone just has a strong a particular way that they have to have something, or if the parent is overly relaxed during potty training and they kind of just allow the child to do whatever during that time, then as an adult they could have an anal expulsive personality, where they are overly messy, careless, disorganized, and prone to emotional outbursts. The next stage is the phallic stage, where the child is 3 to 6 years old. Their erogenous zone is their genitals. A major conflict arises when the child feels a desire for their opposite sex parent and jealousy and hatred toward the same-sex parent. So, for boys, they develop a sexual desire for their mothers, and because of this, they feel an urge to replace their fathers, right? They want to be with their moms, so they need to get rid of their dads. But they are worried that their fathers, in knowing this, are going to punish them. And in this punishment, they're worried that their fathers are going to castrate them. And so this creates castration anxiety in young boys this age. And this is labeled as the Oedipus complex. So again, just to recap, boys between 3 to 6 years old develop a sexual desire for their mother, and therefore an urge to replace their father, but are scared that their father is going to realize this and punish them by castrating them. Okay. By the same token, girls develop what's called the Electra complex, which is the sexual desire for their father, and an urge to replace their mother, which then develops into anger towards their mother for not providing them with a penis, which develops into penis envy. I guess because if they had a penis, they could replace their mother? This is Freud. I don't know what to tell you. If the child is able to start to relate to their same-sex parent and understand that they have things that are similar with them, then they can be like, oh, look at us, we have all these things that are the same. Then they can move on from this stage in a healthy way. If they get fixated, then they will develop vanity and overambition, apparently. That's the phallic stage. Okay. Latency stage, 6 to 12 years. There is no erogenous zone in this one. And any sexual feelings are dormant. And kids can finally just be kids. Thanks, Freud. They can focus on school, friendships, hobbies, and just hang out with their same-sex peers. And then next is the genital stage from 12 years on up. The erogenous zone goes back to their genitals. They have a sexual reawakening where their urges are redirected from the parents to more socially acceptable partners, like people their own age. And that is Freud's psychosexual stages of development. So, yeah. Now, you might be asking, like, where in the world did he come up with these? And what possibly led him to thinking that this was reasonable and true and not at all really freaking weird, which it is. And the only reasoning I can give to you is the case study of little Hans. Now, mind you, he had already developed these stages before he learned of little Hans, and he only met with little Hans one time. So it's not like little Hans was really his patient and he had all this direct experience with him. He mainly corresponded with little Hans's father through letters back and forth. And keep in mind that this father was already a fan, if you will, of Freud's work. So it is likely that he took what he already knew about Freud and kind of worked with that information from there. So Freud uses this as a way to say that he has proof of the Oedipus complex. And he likes to say, oh yeah, little Hans is, my example, that this is scientific. But I hope you'll take a moment to go back and watch this video and see that that doesn't really hold water. And yeah, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But just to do a quick little recap, little Hans was a 5-year-old boy with a phobia of horses. And this case study, the primary aim was to treat that phobia. And Freud's therapeutic input was very minimal in this case. The secondary aim was to explore what factors might have led to the phobia in the first place and what factors led to its remission. So from around 3 years of age, little Hans showed an interest in what he called whittlers, which was his word for penises. And he was interested in his own penis and with those of other males, including animals. But at which point his mother did threaten to cut off his whittler unless he stopped playing with it. Keep in mind that for a 3-year-old to be interested in his penis and other penises, that is completely normal of child development. But what's not normal is for a mother to threaten to cut off their child's penis. So no wonder why he had some issues. He also had a fear of horses, and this started when he saw a horse fall over and die in front of him on the street. And so after his mother threatened to cut off his whittler, his fear of horses actually worsened, and he was reluctant to go out in case he met a horse. So instead of thinking about, the fact that he had witnessed a horse die, Freud linked his fear to the horse's large penis, despite the fact that Hans initially said he was scared the horses would fall over and make a noise with their feet. Eventually, the phobia improved, relating only to horses with black harnesses over their noses. So Hans's father suggested that this symbolized his mustache. Freud's interpretation linked Hans's fear to the Oedipus complex, the horses with the black harnesses and big penises, unconsciously representing his fear of his father. I think that's a pretty big leap, but okay. Freud suggested that Hans resolved this conflict as he fantasized about himself with a big penis and married his mother. This allowed Hans to overcome his castration anxiety and identify with his father. So even if we suspend all reality and say, sure, this was a great example of the Oedipus complex and Hans going through the phallic stage of the psychosexual stages of development, it's still only one case study. And like we've talked about before with case studies, we can't generalize them to larger populations, right? So this does not mean that this is true for all children experiencing the phallic stage and all boys experiencing the Oedipus complex, right? That's way too gigantic of a leap to make. Okay, you may have heard of the term Freudian slip before. That is when a person is speaking and they suddenly say a word or phrase that they didn't intend to say out loud, and it slips out. Freud believed that it revealed their subconscious thoughts. He said, "I almost invariably discover a disturbing influence in addition, which comes from something outside the intended utterance. And the disturbing element is either a single thought that has remained unconscious, which manifests itself in the slip of the tongue." Some examples are a manager accidentally says to an employee, "I'd love to take you out on a date," instead of "I'd love to take you out to lunch." So that would imply that the manager actually does secretly have feelings for the employee. Another one is Ada intends to say how much she loves chocolate, and instead she blunders and says how much she loves Charlie, who's sitting across from her. So there really is no empirical evidence to support this. Most likely they happen just because someone is tired or distracted. All right, getting into Anna Freud's contributions. She worked as an elementary teacher after high school and worked translating her father's writings. The combination of these increased her own interest in child psychology and psychoanalysis, and she began a children's psychoanalysis practice in 1923. In 1927, she published Introduction to the Technique of Child Psychoanalysis, which was a significant development in the therapeutic treatment of children. Freud recognized that children's mental health symptoms differed from those of adults, and she pointed out importantly that they often were related to various stages of development. She also recognized that each child as an individual with their own needs and believed that therapeutic alliances needed to be established according to each child. In adapting psychoanalysis for children, Anna Freud recognized that lying on a couch was not conducive to children staying focused during therapy. Instead, she encouraged them to sit on the floor and play and draw, which she felt helped them to be more expressive, free, and truthful, which is how most children's therapy is done to this day. Freud's dedication to children and child development extended beyond the therapy room. She began to volunteer work in 1919 at the Baumgarten Children's Home, which served Jewish children who had been orphaned or made homeless because of World War I. In 1937, she and a colleague founded the Jackson Nursery, a nursery school for children living in poverty in Vienna. There, through investigative work, she discovered that children who were allowed to choose their own food ate better, gained needed weight, and achieved nutritional balance by themselves. Her work in Vienna was cut short, however, by the Nazi invasion of Austria and then by Anna's own arrest and interrogation by the Nazis in 1938. Able to convince her interrogators that her work was innocuous, Freud, who was Jewish, was able to obtain a visa to leave Vienna with her famous father and head to London, where Sigmund died just a few weeks later. Freud continued with her work with children in London, establishing the Hampstead War Nursery, which provided foster care for single-parent families. During this time, she conducted research into children's trauma, which demonstrated that children who remained in London and endured Nazi bombings fared better emotionally than those who were sent away from their families to presumably safer surroundings. Post-World War II, Freud established the Hampstead Child Therapy Center, which was granted charity status. The center, dedicated to child analysis and research, trained the first generation of child psychotherapists to work in the fledgling National Health Service in England. Renamed the Anna Freud Center, the clinic exists today, recently celebrating its 70th year as a charity. Freud also published Normality and Pathology in Childhood in 1965, which significantly contributed to the establishment of the field of developmental psychology. Freud continued her work at her clinic until she died in 1983. Her contributions continue to impact the field of psychology and greatly shaped our understanding and approach to the treatment of children. This here, I have linked a Freudian personality test. So if you are interested in where you fall in his different ranges in terms of the psychosexual development stages, as well as the different types of places that you can get stuck in there, then I would recommend that you click on there. It's just kind of fun to know what Freud would say about you, even if we can't, even if you should take it with a grain of salt, I should say. And then lastly, this is a quick little video on why we still teach Freud. Just some final thoughts on him, knowing that we cannot necessarily take everything for scientific or empirical relevance, but it is still important to consider, especially for the impacts that he had on the psychology field and for the advancements that were made, just because he really did put the field to the forefront and allowed it to be talked about and to be studied. And it may not have happened in the way that it did without his teachings. So, all right, we are going to end there, and we will finish chapter 11